Revelation 1900. From the 28th of April 1941. Bound will. Knowing God's love. The life-giving influx of divine power flows through all works of creation and is therefore the primordial power and the source of all life. The divine will, which gave rise to everything, now also ensures the existence of what is. The meaning and purpose of creation is the return of all spiritual to God as its origin. Consequently, the spiritual receives the strength from God in order to be able to accomplish the return to Him. If the spiritual essence refused to accept the strength, it would also have no possibility of development, for without the influx of divine strength the works of creation could not exist. Thus the spiritual essence would not be able to change either, and consequently it would remain in the same state as it was when it fell away from God. And the spiritual essence would refuse to receive this strength if it had to determine it itself, for it emerged from the adversary's will, and his will was also transferred to the spiritual essence, even though it received the right of self-determination from God. And thus the spiritual had to be incorporated into the work of creation against its will. Thus its will was bound, and that for its redemption out of the will of the adversary. The resistance against God remained, but the being is powerless in the face of divine will. What the being did not recognize in its delusion it must learn to recognize in an infinitely long change through creation. The infinite love of God. Every work of creation betrays God's love, and when the being, against its will, feels the strength from God, that is when it enters the circuit of divine love, its stubborn resistance begins to weaken and the bound will turns to the eternal deity of its own accord. And God increasingly loosens the still bound will and gives the being more freedom the more its will meets Him by fulfilling its assigned task, that is by being willing to serve. Although it cannot refuse to carry out the serving activity it is destined for since it is in a certain state of compulsion, but if the spiritual will is willing to do so at the same time it gives up its former resistance and advances in higher development. Thus the being will feel God's love in every external form, yet it will only recognize God's love in its final stage as a human being, that is the connection of all things with God and itself as His living creation. And therefore free will can only be given to it again as a human being. Misusing it is a step backwards, using it correctly is progress in its higher development. And this is divine love, which lets nothing fall, even though it stands in blatant opposition to God. But how much more intimately does divine love embrace the beings which try to approach Him of their own accord, and to whom the earthly life has brought the recognition of the eternal deity and its infinite love. Every striving towards God is pleasing to Him as long as it is truly, that is inwardly felt. And what merciful love He shows to the being which errs and yet is willing. He seeks to guide it to the right realization as long as it does not oppose Him. And all earthly torments are intended to purify the spiritual being which does not completely entrust itself to God's guidance and therefore is still wavering in its right realization. God's love wants to be recognized through love, and active love activity therefore also brings the human being closer to divine love. To serve God in free will means to give love to fellow human beings. The recognition of divine love will become easy for them, and in retrospect they will understand God's infinite love at the end of their physical life, which banished the essence in order to set it free. Amen.